I was thinking that we could spend a little bit of time talking about the LSAT, a little bit on admissions, then open it up to Q&A. How does that sound to you?
Sounds great.
Awesome. All right. So I was thinking I would just give a little bit of an overview very quickly, just a couple minutes, some of the recent changes this year. Curious to get your thoughts on some of those things as well. Then we'll flip it around. Then we'll open it up. All right. So for tonight, I was thinking just to start off, we are right now about 1 month away from the September LSAT, a little bit less. This is the first fully digital LSAT in North America. July was the 50-50 transitional LSAT, but going forward, totally digital in North America. Those overseas, of course, still getting the paper and pencil format. Very quickly, I recommend applicants go on familiar.lsac.org just to get used to the digital LSAT format. Do it on a tablet, not a computer, just to fully get used to all the interactive features, the highlighting, the underlining, the notations that you're making on the scratch paper on the side, not on the test booklet itself. Do you have to get a tablet? No. LSAC is using a Microsoft Surface Go specifically, but any old tablet is totally fine. Samsung, iPad, all good. Amazon Fire is only $150. You could always return it afterwards if you decide that it's not for you, but it is good to get used to a little bit of what that format is like. Borrow one if you have to. If you have the PDFs, you could keep them on your computer screen, use scratch paper on the side, and of course, because you cannot draw freehand on the tablet LSAT itself, so you got to use that booklet of scratch paper, about 12 to 14 pages, unlined, 8.5 by 11 paper, that thin newsprint that you're used to seeing from the old LSAT. That's the best way to practice. I have plenty more I can say on the LSAT going forward, but I don't want to just ramble on for a long time. I'm sure all of you will have plenty of questions on LSAT prep, so we'll get into some of the details a little bit later. Chris, I want to turn it over to you just to speak a little bit about your background, what you do at MSU College of Law, and a little bit on law school admissions this cycle.
Yeah, so as Steve said, my name is Chris Jackson. I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions at Michigan State University College of Law. I've been there over 2 years now. Surprisingly, time flies. I'm actually an alum of the institution. I worked in nonprofit practice for quite a few years before coming back to work at the law school. So I've been through it, lived through it. I've dealt with the LSAT myself, not too many years ago, I like to think. But I definitely recognize the challenges that can come with it. And so digital LSAT's definitely an interesting move, and I think it's a great thing for individuals. I think it'll make it much easier and alleviate some of the concerns and burdens others have had in the past with misnumbering their tests or bubbling in at the wrong number, things like that. So I think it's really a great move forward.
Yeah, awesome. You want to share a little bit about what you're seeing this cycle in terms of what you're anticipating this cycle for applicants?
Yeah, so I know a lot of schools are still releasing their scores for medians for LSAT, GPA, and whatnot from the last cycle. So I'm interested to see those, obviously, across the board to see who's went up, who's went down, and kind of stayed static. So it's a kind of ever competing, aspect of that. So some schools have started already admitting students. I know that, surprisingly, for this upcoming cycle. Our application's opening up on the 1st. And many schools are that way as well. But I do know I read on places like Reddit and law school numbers that things have already been flowing and admitted. So I expect to probably see a continued increase across the board for schools trying to increase those medians, especially as the rankings become ever tighter. There was a substantial number, with U.S. News that were ties. And rankings are a huge component of that and are kind of the easiest for schools to change year over year. And so they're going to continue to push forward with that. So both those numbers can play a huge role.
Wow, that's really interesting. So you're saying that some schools have started accepting applicants to begin next fall, even though traditionally applications may not have even been open yet.
Yeah. So I have read some schools online have already started calling and admitting students within a couple of days of applications being submitted. So the application cycle has started, definitely. And I would recommend looking to see if your school you're interested in is already accepting applications. If they are, finding out when they'll start to make decisions and what the decision process really is like. I know many institutions will do a huge batch of admissions time to time, maybe once a month or once every few weeks. Others, they'll kind of just slowly trickle out day by day. And so with that process, really kind of seeing what they've done in the past. And many times you can assume that it'll be pretty similar in practice year to year.
Right, right. So if things are potentially starting a little bit earlier and the cycle's kind of lengthening overall, as it's been going later in recent years, now it's also going earlier as well. How does that impact how you might recommend applicants time taking the LSAT? Is there a benefit to being done with it by November and keeping it within this calendar year?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously, we've seen even LSAT adjusting to it with LSAC adjusting with the LSAT, going from 4 test cycle to a 6 test cycle. Now we're going on 9. So I do think that it can be beneficial to take it early. Obviously, even looking at potentially your junior year, taking it, especially as it continues. I think this year it's December, May, and August are the only months that won't have an exam. And so continuing to look at that cycle. A lot of it's going to depend on priority deadlines versus early decision deadlines, those type of things, and what you're looking for. You don't want to apply for an early binding decision, at least, if that's not what you want to do. So really making sure that you're paying attention to those components can be a huge component of it. And, some institutions start their priority deadline as of November or even December before the 2020 even rings in, so to speak. So really looking at the timelines for the schools that I would say are goal schools or even necessarily your reach schools and kind of plan your cycle from there.
Right. What would you consider to be too late in the cycle where applicants might be better off just waiting a year?
It really depends. Institution by institution, I would say those priority deadlines are important. So if there is a priority deadline, once you get to that point, it can really, while it might not impact your admission decision, it could really impact scholarship. And so if you're looking for high dollar scholarships, and, all the way up to full tuition for some institutions, applying before those priority deadlines can really have a major impact on the amount that you could get. It could be after the fact that you would get a smaller scholarship even with the same scores and same GPA.
Sure. Now, could you speak a little bit about the situation at MSU College of Law specifically?
Yeah. So our like I said, our application will be opening in a few days. It's supposed to open on the 1st, and our decisions actually start rolling out. We say mid-November, rather under promise and over deliver. So mid-November is when we expect those to roll out, and then our priority deadline is actually March 1st. Our final deadline is April 30th, and so. I know that it can have a major impact applying after that priority deadline because the amount of scholarships available does diminish as we go through the cycle. So applying early not only can increase your chances if you might be on the cusp, but also even with higher scores, scholarships can be reduced a little bit because the scholarship funds are no longer available in that regard. The other component is many institutions, and ourselves included, in the past couple of years have allowed students who have taken the June LSAT, for example, to go ahead and apply for that cycle if they want to. And obviously it's a case-by-case basis for both admission and scholarship, but that's also something you can look out for if you choose to wait to apply and take a later LSAT. Right.
Thanks for sharing that. Now, speaking of June, I'm just thinking of June because June is actually also the first time the writing sample went digital. And we got a question about the writing sample. How might you expect yourself and others to look at writing samples now that the LSAT has gone digital with that, where it's typed out, applicants aren't doing it on the day of anymore? Might you look at it more closely than otherwise?
I will say I was surprised. I actually forgot when I reviewed my first file from the June LSAT that had that typed version. I was like, oh, yeah, I forgot that they're doing this. And so I think it'll be easier. It makes the files a little smaller, and so every bit counts with that when the review process is going on. As you can imagine, reviewing thousands of files can be tedious, to say the least. So I do think that it may be easier. It obviously is going to increase legibility, which is important. Also, I think conversely will point out more grammatical errors in it to an extent. It makes, as it's easier to read, whereas you may have just brushed over them, you might see some of those. So making sure that you're using the proper punctuation and grammar, I think is important, especially because it is typed. So I'll be interested to see ourselves, the volume of applications we see this year that have that, because we will have many students, I think, that took the LSAT last year. Some trying to get under the wire for the digital, not wanting to do digital because they prefer the good old pen and paper. So I think this year will be really a hybrid in that aspect. And I think, and I'm pretty sure applications, if they've taken multiple LSATs, will have both versions. Going forward, you don't have to continue to retake the written portion from what I've read on the digital version. So that'll be something else that we'll also see in some applications.
Yeah, correct. I've been getting some students asking, do they have to redo the writing sample with digital if they've already done paper? And the answer is no. You've only got to do it once ever. And so if you did it handwritten, you don't have to do it again. You could just be done with it. But alternatively, if you want another shot at it, if you want to type it out and maybe do a better job the second or third time around, you can. And it's only $15, which I know sounds silly to pay again for it. But if you want a typed version, if you want to submit your best writing possible where your brain's not fried after doing 5 LSAT sections, it'll probably be a better result in the end.
Yeah, and I think there'll be a convenience factor too with the saving the time on test day. Just those little things will definitely help that you won't have that extra component that you have to deal with.
Yeah, everyone gets to go home 35 minutes earlier.
Yep.
We got some questions on GPA and LSAT, specifically asking if you're submitting with a low GPA or a low LSAT score, what would you suggest applicants do to mitigate that in their applications, whether it's writing an addendum or not? How do they decide? And then just overall, how do they make the strongest application possible despite that?
Yeah, I think it's twofold because you'll have situations where students may be what is called splitters. And so they may have that lower LSAT GPA, but conversely have the opposite higher. And then you have others that may be struggling in both categories. And so those are kind of going to be different approaches to an extent. Students are splitters. Don't fret. Majority of students are splitters in some way or another. And so we don't expect everybody to be applying with those 75th percentiles in both categories. And so don't panic in those situations. If it is a situation that you are on the lower end for both numbers, it's still important to apply. Don't be afraid to apply. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. And so that's the first thing I would say. And there's students that have come to my office and sat down and talked about it. And, we talked through everything and they ended up still getting admitted, even though they may have been at or below 25th percentiles for other components. So addendum can be really important, especially if there's been life events that have challenged situations, whether it's, loss of family members, struggling through working 2 jobs and going to school. Those type of things are really important. To let us know. Obviously, if it's more situations of things like you've been disciplined because of, unfortunately, plagiarism occurs sometimes, and that caused you to fail a class, definitely point that out. While you can't really write it off in any good ways, it's important to acknowledge as part of that, not only for admission, but also when it comes to the bar exam time of things. It's some schools offer optional writing prompts. Whether it's actual specific prompt and it's like why X school and why do you want to go there. So those can be important. And I know those do make a decision impact. Others will give you options to write about general topics. So at MSU, we have our optional diversity statement, and I know many schools do. And so talk to the admissions office if you have questions about those, because those can be really beneficial. And so I know for ours, for example, we look holistically at that as a component. And so it's not just the traditional notions of diversity that we're looking for. We're looking for everything that you'll bring to the classroom and to the profession. And so a lot of us have strengths that you might not think about in that diverse aspect, but can really bring unique things to the table. And that's what a lot of times the admissions offices are looking for.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that rundown. I think it's really useful to think about how we could use all the different parts of the application to paint a fuller picture. We've got a question from Jay here asking, I'm wondering how law schools would look at past LSAT scores if there's a massive difference, like a 20-point jump. Are you skeptical of that, or do you just take the highest score and calculate that?
I would say it's a middle ground. So based off the highest score, at least for us, we see the other scores. We tell students, if you do have a large jump, just tell us why. So that's another reason to use an addendum. And with the addenda, you would be able to say, I was studying, I took a year off and I studied, 12 hours a week or 20 hours a week or whatever you were doing that helped increase that score. I wouldn't say we're skeptical of those increases. More than anything, it really represents your ability to put in that hard work and push yourself to succeed. So it's not a negative to have those increases. And so even if it takes a couple tests and you end up getting an increase. So I would say that it's not a bad thing, but it's always good to give a frame of reference on that.
Yeah, that's a good answer, I think. What about retakes? Let's say someone has taken the LSAT 3 or 4 times. How many times is too many?
I would say that's going to come down to rapidity of how often you're doing it. So if you're doing it, especially now that there's 9 times, if you're doing it every single month, I would say that is more concerning than somebody who's taken 2 or 3 years to do it the same amount of times. If you're taking that time to spread it out, practice, get a better understanding, and reevaluate your study methods, that's going to be much more beneficial. I've seen applications that have had students, I think the most I saw this year was 6 LSAT scores, maybe 7. And so some of them, bounced around and kind of were in a cloud of maybe 5 points. And I saw others that they did 2 or 3. And then that 3rd or 4th time they took it, they had a substantial jump of 7 or 8 points. And so that can be a huge difference. And so it's something to think about. So I wouldn't say it's a bad thing.
7, 8 points is going to open a lot more doors or or get you more scholarship money. And I love the idea of retaking, because even just through luck alone, you could do a few points better. And then if you study on top of that, you could do even better. LSAC also has the new retake limit they implemented this year. It used to be there were no limits. You could take it every month, year round. With those 9 times, you could take it all 9 times if you wanted. Now it's 3 times in a cycle, 5 times in a 5-year period, 7 times in your lifetime, but you can apply for exemptions to that limit. But I think that limit will serve to counteract some of the rapidity in retaking. But if you haven't taken it before, you could take it September, October, November if you wanted to, and then you're done until July of next year, because the year runs, I think, June to May. It runs June to May, I think, for LSAT, strangely. But it is what it is. But I think at least 2 times in the fall could be good, because then you have only a 4 to 5 week gap in between retakes. So just stay fresh on it another 4 or 5 weeks, do another timed exam a week or something, then maybe you improve a couple points from that alone.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, and it's kind of tangential, but is if you were denied admission and you're reapplying for the following cycle, biggest impact you can make on your application is to go ahead and take the LSAT again. Take that time to prepare and really knock it out of the park, because that's the most tangible impact you can have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, when you have applicants where, let's say their application looks really good, but their LSAT's just a few points below what you're looking for, are there ever cases where you would go and say to them, we just need you to get 3 to 5 points higher or 2 points higher, come back to us next year? How does that typically work? Or do applicants come to you to asking those questions?
Definitely the latter. We get lots of students. I just had a phone call with one a couple days ago. Actually talked to quite a few over the past few weeks, because we're kind of in that period where it's, I didn't get pulled off the wait list because I was waitlisted, or I was a late applicant, I was denied, etc., or I asked for reconsideration, all those types of things. So we definitely get lots of students. I don't think there's ever really a situation we'll outright say retake the LSAT and you're going to be in, because we can't guarantee that type of thing. We'll definitely encourage anybody and everybody to take the LSAT again if that is a component of the application. And obviously, we'll talk about other things. Obviously, GPA you can't really impact at that point in time, because you typically have already graduated, with minor exceptions of like a 3+3 program or something. And so I would say that, and getting some professional experience are some of the things we recommend most to individuals.
Right. Now, what about the GRE? Mm-hmm. How are you looking at GRE scores? Are you taking GRE scores? How do you consider, which applicants would a GRE application be good for?
So we currently only have a pilot for the GRE with MSU students specifically. So it's a very, very case-by-case circumstance. We have information about that in our application. And so GRE, I haven't looked too much into it. I know a variety of institutions have started taking it in various capacities. If you have an LSAT score, you have to report it. And that's going to be reported as part of the ABA. So I don't know if schools are considering the GRE to supplement that, since they still have to report it. But if you are looking at an institution going the GRE route, I would definitely recommend not taking the LSAT if you're going to do that, because that LSAT score has to be reported and could have a negative impact on your application. So.
Right. So if someone took an official LSAT and got a 140, then they say, the LSAT's clearly not for me. I'm going to go for the GRE instead. It's kind of too late because they have that LSAT score on the record already.
Yep. So that's the thing to look out for. So think about planning that ahead of time. As somebody who's taken both the GRE and LSAT, they're significantly different tests in that regard. So choose wisely on which path. And again, schools have various components of what they're doing with students who apply with the GRE when it comes to scholarships and things like that. So I know that ETS has a score matcher, so you can get a projected score. So I don't know if many schools are using that to decide whether a student would be adequate based on their GRE converted to an LSAT score. I've had a few situations where I've utilized it when I've had the chance just to see. So it does vary, but if you have both scores, it's an interesting thing to test and check out.
That'd be fun to play around with a little bit. I'll have to look at that and see how I evaluate that.
Yeah.
It's tough to equate the two given how different they are, as you said.
Definitely.
Got a question about MSU Law specifically. Can you share a little bit about some of the unique programs that you offer?
Yeah, so we have a variety of unique programs. Some of our most well-known are Indigenous Law and Policy Center. It's one of only a handful in the entire country. And on top of that, we're only a very select few schools actually provide a certificate as part of their JD in Indigenous law. And so we have that as a very prestigious program. And we have various Indigenous tribes in Michigan that participate in that. And they also have relationships with tribes across the entire country. Outside that, intellectual property intellectual property and information communications is a huge program as well that we have a variety of institutions within the law school and centers that give students real tangible ability to interact with those things, whether it's anti-counterfeiting initiatives and program that we have at the university at large, things like our Center for Law, Technology, and Innovation. They just changed the name, so I'm still getting used to it. That's a really prestigious program with Professor Reyes running that. So those are really great. Our FIGER Trial Practice Institute is very prestigious in that students who are interested in doing litigation specifically go through that program and commit roughly 5 credit hours per semester of their 2L and 3L years to focus on litigation courses, interacting with judges who many are teaching their classes, trial attorneys with decades of experience teaching those courses as well. So those are some great opportunities. For those that are more local to Michigan itself, we have our Michigan Leadership Initiative, which isn't actually a curricular program, but it's more extracurricular in a sense that a handful of incoming students each year are selected for that. And it gives them a wonderful opportunity to interact with leaders in business, nonprofit, government, across the entire state, many of whom are alums. And so we have alums who have worked for Boeing. We've had some former Michigan Supreme Court justices participate in that. We've had participants who are working at large firms across the country, have been in JAG, et cetera. So real innovators in many different capacities. So it's really a great program that's really taken off in the past couple of years as well.
Those sound like some really unique programs. And I assume that you have, from your homepage, you have links where students can find out more on each of these programs.
Yeah, and so definitely check that out because we do have that. We have actually 13 different focus areas. So while I didn't touch nearly all of them, we really do have a variety of interests for students, especially those interested in pursuing things like dual degrees.
Right. Awesome. I'll definitely share the link with students afterwards if they want to find out more.
Great.
We got a question from Adaro asking how the application process is different for older applicants and what can older applicants or non-traditional applicants, what can they do to stand out?
Yeah, so a lot of it really depends on what your non-traditional definition is. And we have students from the wide range of ages. I know we've had students, I think this year we had one student who is at least in their 40s, if not 50s. I would say between 5 and 10% of our students every year are over the age of 30. And I would say not a majority, but as we continue to go on, more and more of our students have gone into the profession, worked for a few years, and are now coming back, or even taking just gap years. So the kind of the K through JD, as you'll hear, it doesn't happen as much anymore. I know I was one, but many of my classmates went out and worked in business, worked in things like medicine. I had a classmate who was in nursing before going to law school. So don't look at it as a negative. Use it as a benefit and talk about all those different things and life experiences, whether it's the rough and tumbles or just the experience in the boardroom or, in the day-to-day, trenches of corporate life that you've experienced and how that will impact what you bring to the classroom. It really is as much about the admissions process as what you're going to be bringing to the law school as much as the law school is going to give you. And so that goes into things like the diversity statements and whatnot. So you really use it as a benefit and don't reflect on it as a negative, because the non-traditional student continues to be a larger and larger portion of the student body across the board.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's shifted?
I think it's part of it's economic changes over the past decade. As somebody who went in 2010 and has seen legal landscape change, both as a student and then going out in the field as an attorney, I think that's a component of it. And the flip side of that is, as the economy improves for some, but not all, as the economy continues to improve, more individuals are able to take gap years, whether it's to go do a Peace Corps or go and decide whether law is really what they want to do, or, spend their time working part-time and doing an internship with a judge or as a clerk, those type of things. So I think it's really just a variety. There's also a lot more individuals engaging in the legal system and the politicking, the governments, all those different types of things at all ages. And many of them feel like going back to law school can really have a huge component of that. And so I think that factors into it as well.
Yeah, I've noticed more people taking time in between undergrad and grad school and law school specifically. So I was curious about that. Also, I'm wondering, I get this question a lot. Students who are currently in college, they question whether they should go directly or whether law schools want them to take time off in between. And I'm wondering if there are certain student profiles, students with certain backgrounds, who would benefit from taking at least 1 year off.
I don't necessarily think so. We may have some students, especially with IP fields, the more hard sciences, we'll see a lot, I think, somewhat of a larger number go into the field and decide that maybe research isn't what they want to do, or engineering isn't what they want to do, but they really still have an interest in the sciences and they really want to be about the more protecting the research itself than doing the research. And so a lot of those, I think, go out and have a year or two, or go out into environmental science is another one, and decide they want to go into the law side of things with that understanding. But yeah, I wouldn't say there's, at least for us, we don't expect students to go out into the field. It really is a individual decision and what you feel is best for you. Some students just want to go and pay off the student loans. So they'll go work 2 or 3 years, pay off what they have, hope that they can go back into law school on a full tuition scholarship and really minimize that debt. Conversely, obviously, there's always the question of if you take a year or two off, are you going to go back? Right. We have that discussion a lot, and students will be like, they'll come visit our office and be like, I've been out in the field for 2 or 3 years. I don't know if I can go back to that lifestyle of being a student. And I totally get that.
Yeah.
So that is, I think, part of the decision as well. And everybody has their own decision-making process for that.
Yeah, academia is certainly a different world. Now, not to belabor the point, but I do have one last follow-up on this point. Yeah. Students who, let's say their GPA in undergrad isn't what they would have liked, then those students in particular, they're often cautious about going directly because they worry that their GPA is going to weigh a bit more heavily. Let's say instead they take a few years, they get some work experience. Might that mitigate the lower GPA because the work experience is now an extra piece of the pie?
Yeah, that soft criteria or experience, however you want to bill it, definitely can have an impact. I can't say it'll be the end all be all, but it definitely can make a major impact, especially depending on the field you go into. Some will go work for a law firm and get that experience and decide that that's what they want to do. Others will go do many different things. So I think it can be helpful. But also as a part of that is really thinking about how in those next, 1, 2, 3 years, whatever it be, how you're going to really facilitate that prep for the LSAT. Right. Use that time. Because that's going to be the largest hard factor that you're going to be able to have an impact on. And really, in many ways, a great LSAT score can outweigh some of the benefits of the softs that you would gain during that time.
Right. So I guess even the bigger question then outside all of this is, will you do better prepping for the LSAT while you're in college, or will you do better while you're working as a paralegal for a couple of years where you might have a busy work schedule? Right. What lifestyle is going to facilitate the top LSAT score?
Correct. Yep. Yeah. And it could be a thing where you decide during your senior year that you take it and your score wasn't as good and you go 2 or 3 years and you decide that you've studied enough while you're working in the field that you're going to go ahead and give it another shot. And I've seen students go up, 10, 15 points by doing that. So, but again, it's a case-by-case scenario. So I won't say that everybody will have that results, but it's something to think about.
Yeah, but if you can take the time, big score increases are possible. And so if you have a gap year where your parents are supporting you, you can just study for the LSAT full time. That's definitely within the ballpark of possibility. Definitely possible for it to happen. Let's see, we got a few more questions here in the chat. One person was asking, how many LSATs can a person take in a lifetime? Back to our earlier discussion of the retake limits. The limit is 7 times in a lifetime going forward. It's 3 in one cycle, 5 in 5 years, 7 for life. You can apply for exemptions to this rule, but it's LSAC's discretion, case-by-case basis. If you just Google new LSAT retake limits, you'll find a detailed list of all the new limitations. David's asking, for those who have a lower GPA due to commitments such as full-time active duty military, would an addendum help explain that? Do you recommend an addendum in that case?
Definitely. Highlighting that is going to be an important thing. Let us know that that's had an impact on that. We totally get that. I actually remember an application the last couple of years of a student who was talking about how they were studying, they were deployed and they were studying in their off-duty time to be able to take the LSAT and the challenges that presented and, the impact that had on social life during deployment, things like that. So definitely highlight that. Obviously, that service is also something to reflect on your resume and any questions on the application too, because that can be impact on both any sort of scholarships, obviously in the positive, but also in admissions is considered as part of it.
Yeah, and also I've worked with a number of students who are studying overseas, whether it's the Peace Corps or the military or study abroad, and it definitely is harder. First off, it's hard to get physical books shipped from North America. A lot of books are regional. And then there's also just the fact that the test centers overseas may not be the best quality test centers. It could be hard to find them. The proctors may not do as good a job depending on the situation. For some, the plus might be that the digital LSAT's only in North America right now. And so if you want to avoid that and do the paper version, you could go overseas. And that might be a little bit extreme to go just for that reason. But if you happen to be overseas, that's definitely a plus. And for some strange reason, this cycle, this fall, October and November LSATs, there are not enough test centers available in North America right now. Most applicants are on the wait list for October and November. And so if you happen to be going on vacation in Italy, maybe you look and see if there's a test center available there. All right, we got another question here. Could you talk a bit more about early decision, the priority deadlines you were talking about, and whether and how much of a boost it provides your chances? At the same time, though, of course, it limits scholarship opportunities.
Yeah, so I guess there's two there. There's the early decisions and priority deadlines. And so those are significantly different things. And so you want to make sure that you're looking out for those and looking at the language that's used and any information in the actual application instructions. Many of those early decision situations are binding. And so if you're admitted, regardless of what your scholarship offer is, they expect you to commit to that and keep your end of the bargain, so to speak. And so that is an important thing compared to something like a priority deadline. A priority deadline is basically hey, this is where we anticipate having a large number of the seats in the class filled, whether it's through deposits or through the number of applicants that we've admitted and expect to deposit, or we've in the past started to run out of scholarship funds. And so some schools only have a finite amount of money each year, and they apportion it based on what they assume will be the incoming class that they've offered it to. So it can impact in those situations if there are less seats available at that point. If they feel like they are full and their melt or yield is going to be higher than anticipated on the yield side, then that can really have an impact. The scholarship side of things, it just varies by institution, I would say. But I have, I think I said earlier, I have seen students who have been applied either right at the final deadline or even applied with like a June LSAT that got a lower scholarship for that cycle because they were at the tail end of things and really the class had been kind of settled, so to speak, in many different ways.
And thanks for breaking that down. I think it's important to know what's binding, what's not binding, because there is a massive difference in them.
Definitely. And we hear students that they will have applied to us, have been admitted, and then they accidentally or knowingly applied early decision to another institution that's binding, and they are trying to figure out what they can do if they still want to come to us or even to another institution. So,
what can they do? How does that typically play out? What are the different possibilities?
It varies. So it's a touchy subject because we hope that students will keep their word on what they apply for. The biggest thing I will say is the law school admissions world is small. Even though we're all across the country, we know each other, and I've heard of times that a school has called another school and said, "Hey, my early decisioners is saying they're leaving to go to you guys. They made this commitment. What do you think about that?" Or maybe not to say what do you think about that, but they bring that up, and then you may hear from that other school, like you heard you had a commitment, yeah, etc. So I think it's best to keep your word, but it varies institution to institution, and I know that we ourselves don't do an early decision process, and I would say it seems like schools are less so doing it more than any over the past at least decade. It seems like.
Right. It seems like things are going in the general direction of a little bit more flexibility.
Yeah, definitely.
And also I see that same with law schools. Typically they're waitlisting more applicants, right? That's become a lot more common in recent years.
Yeah. I think part of that may be decreasing incoming class sizes. So that's leading to more being waitlisted, more competition for those higher end LSAT or GPA scores. And so that leads to more students being waitlisted because they may be a large splitter. For example, maybe have a 162 LSAT, but are sub 3.0, for example. Sometimes they'll get waitlisted in case a higher LSAT, higher GPA person drops and goes somewhere else or gets pulled off a waitlist somewhere else. You kind of see that trickle down the way from institutions as peer institutions or a little bit higher ranked institutions pull off their wait list. They'll kind of echo through all of the other ones below that. And so you kind of hear about that. And it's talked about amongst schools and things like that. If they've heard other schools are pulling from the wait list, and some students are like, okay, or some institutions like, okay, we should expect, X, Y, and Z to potentially happen, especially if their regionality is the same or their rankings near the same.
Right. Now, so just to come back to the idea of things happening later in the cycle. So we talked a little bit earlier about how applicants would be better off ideally taking the LSAT and be done in the fall and then submitting then. But if they do retake in the spring, come back with a higher score, let's say they were waitlisted, it could still have that trickle effect if they took the LSAT, let's say, in March or in April.
Yeah, and I think even bigger thing is to ask if you can have reconsideration. If you have a higher LSAT score and you've been waitlisted, call them up and let them know and say, hey, can I have my application reconsidered? Or generally they're going to ask for an email because they like it in writing. But at least reach out to them verbally to see what the possibilities are. They may just say, in our situation, I know we do, we'll say, send us an email requesting it, and we'll pass it along to the admissions committee. And so that could potentially even get you pulled off the wait list without having to go through the wait list process later into the cycle.
Oh, interesting. So there's reconsideration. That's beyond simply a letter of continued interest.
Correct. So if there's a situation where you've had a substantial increase in your LSAT score, and some institutions, again, varies widely, will go ahead and reconsider that application, whether you've already been waitlisted or even denied potentially. You could ask for reconsideration as part of that.
Oh, nice. That's awesome. That's really good to know. So it's considered extremely important and worth reaching out for. In contrast, what would a letter of continued interest be for?
Letter of continued interest is really, say you took the October and we'll say January LSAT, you were waitlisted in March, you're not taking the LSAT again, but you're really interested in that institution. And so it's whether it's the program they offer or the prestige of the institution, or, even things like you have, a family that's gone there, whether for undergrad or for graduate or law school. And that's why you really want to go there. So that those type of things, letting the institution know that you're still interested, we continue to see that activity on your application. And so that puts it higher on the list of potentials to reach out for. If there's a student who's sent letters of continued interest, every 4 to 6 weeks, or has visited campus, etc. And we have others who are similar stats who we haven't heard a word from since they applied in November, other than saying they were accepting their wait list in, end of January. That can have an impact on who we look for in that process. And
right,
that,
so
again,
go ahead, please.
I was going to say it varies on how their waitlist is processed at each institution. Some do numerical rankings, and so they just rank them numerically and they just pull them as they get to the next person. Others do a review of the entire waitlist pool to make a decision on who to pull based on their credentials, based on their experiences, based on the diverse aspects that they'll bring to the classroom.
Interesting. So these letters of continued interest, it could be as simple as you're just following up because you're interested, as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
But you could also, I would imagine, there are also other updates, maybe not like an LSAT score, but like a promotion at work, an award, something else that's happened in life, or if you've simply visited campus in the interim.
Yeah, definitely. And so obviously you don't want to send a letter of continued interest every week. I think on our website we say 4 to 6 weeks, which is usually what I tell students when I talk to them. But use that as a really ability to just keep an update, especially for those soft parts of the application, like work experience, promotions, etc. That can be really helpful. The other component of that is also obviously you can't have as much of an impact as you get in your collegiate career, but increases in GPA. If your GPA goes up, over that winter semester, submit those grades to LSAC, because that'll get updated and it'll get reflected in your file. So when there is a look at the waitlist, they will see that updated GPA as well. And so obviously we all know the math. It's harder to increase your GPA over time, but definitely even those little things like jumping from a 2.9 to a 3.0 can really have a tangible impact.
Yeah, sure. Especially since those are the hard numbers.
Definitely.
All right, thanks for that. We got a question here from Marco asking, 6 years out of undergrad, how much consideration is given to letters of rec? How many letters of rec do you recommend, especially for non-traditional applicants?
Yeah, so the number of letters of recommendation for your application is going to be hugely institution specific. I know some institutions only take 1. Some will say they want 2, and that's what they require, and they won't take any more or less. Some are more flexible, like we are. We say minimum of 2. We do take 3 or 4. I would say many students end up submitting 3. But you want to make sure that they're useful for that. And so, especially if you've been out in the field, as Marco's situation with being 6 years out, definitely look more at the professional side of things. Being that far out is really hard to, 1, potentially track down faculty, 2, have that faculty remember you, especially if you're at a larger institution where you have larger lectures and things like that. But also 3, you're going to have substantial changes as you go throughout your professional career. And so having those professional, whether it's manager, coworkers, etc., provide those can be really much more impactful. If you're 1 or 2 years out, obviously still have a faculty member submit one if you have a good relationship with one. But as you get further out, those letters of recommendation are important because they give us an update beyond what your GPA may have shown. Especially if, as some of us do, party a little bit too hard in college, and the GPA reflects it, really showing that growth professionally and just overall through those letters of recommendation can be really important.
Nice, thanks for that. And what if, could a letter of rec serve as a good reason to submit a letter of continued interest or a follow-up if you got an additional letter of rec from an employer, let's say?
Yeah, it can be a great way to go into that. Some institutions will require you to have that letter of recommendation submitted through LSAC. Others will just go ahead and accept it. But you can go ahead and use the letter of continued interest to raise awareness of that either way. And so that's a component to think about. But it can be a great way. I would say it's very much a scalpel for the application more than a way to bludgeon your way through. Use it strategically. And it can help out. I would say, again, I kind of go off on tangents, but tangentially is the letters of honor, as you'll hear them talked about, is maybe somebody who is an elected official in your community who may barely know you, but they know your aunt's mom's sister or something that is really aren't as helpful. You want to have that personal connection. You want to have that experience with you. And that's not to say elected officials aren't good if you've been an intern or you've worked in their office at the State House. We get a lot of those being here in the capital of Michigan. So those can be good because you have that connection. But if it's just somebody you want to because of their prestige or stature of their position, it's not going to be very impactful. And that goes both for your regular application, but also any sort of letter of continued interest.
Right. But I would imagine if a letter from an alum, how do you consider that? Does that get any more weight?
It depends. We obviously, whenever I read a letter that's from an alum, some of them I know, having my unique situation, but well, I'll note that a letter from an alumni and those type of things. They can be helpful. I wouldn't say they're the end all be all. I wouldn't say that anybody gets treated preferentially in that, but I would say the impact you get from that letter, knowing that they're an alum of your institution and have that connection, and they're recommending somebody, can be an important component. So does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. No, especially if you know them personally, I'm sure that lets you evaluate them better.
Yeah, and I've had calls from alums who have called in, or I've heard of alums calling the deans of the law school, and so we definitely don't want to have any sort of show of impropriety or quid pro quo in those types of things. But those letters, if you have a connection, those letters can help out. Right.
Makes a lot of sense. So I think we've addressed everyone's questions here, unless anyone wants to submit a final one or two. In the meantime, do you want to just share a little bit more about your role at MSU College of Law and how students might be able to get in touch with you?
Yeah, definitely. So my contact information is on our website, but also my email address is chljackson@law.msu.edu. We're always there to answer questions. I think across the board, one thing you'll see from all institutions are admissions office wants to talk to you. They want to hear from you. They want to address your concerns. They want to make sure that you have the best application possible, so you're not wasting your time. And so they're not afraid to answer questions that you may have. And so reach out to them with those, visit campuses, both before being admitted and after, because that can be really helpful as well. It helps you figure out if that's really the type of environment you want to be in. So think about those things. And so, especially in the fall, there's great opportunities throughout the next few months in your communities, really, maybe even on your campus, that you can connect with admissions professionals from all over the entire country, even internationally, for some institutions. And so take advantage of those because they're there. They want you to come visit them. Otherwise, they're going to stand there bored out of their mind. And so I will be all over the country, both coasts, throughout the next few months. So check out our website. Us, along with many other schools, list their travel schedules. So it gives you a chance to know when they're going to be in your community, especially if your school is hosting a fair, and keep an eye out for that school if you're interested in there, because they're going to be there to be able to provide things like fee waivers, but also some of that more inside information to answer those specific questions you might be concerned about.
Awesome, Chris. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight and being so open and accessible and sharing your answers to everyone's most pressing admissions questions. And I'll share a link to your website to follow up with everyone afterwards.
Awesome. Well, I definitely really appreciate it. Thank you, Steve, and thank you for everybody participating. And I hopefully will hear from some of you here in the future.
Definitely. Thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. Take care, all.
Thanks.
Bye.